What would happen if the United States and China, the world's two most powerful nations, went to war? This isn't a Hollywood script, it's a real possibility shaping our future. Such a conflict wouldn't stay on distant battlefields, its shockwaves would reach every continent, disrupting lives everywhere. The global economy, built on trade between these giants, could collapse overnight. Everyday essentials, phones, cars, even medicines, could vanish from shelves. These nations are not just military rivals, they're the engines of global commerce. War would sever supply chains, disrupt the flow of goods, and trigger a crisis unlike any before. The human cost would be staggering, with soldiers and civilians facing dangers unimaginable in past wars. Modern technologies mean cities could become targets, and no one would feel truly safe. The psychological toll would be global, as anxiety and dread replace any sense of normalcy. Understanding this potential conflict isn't about fear, it's about recognizing the stakes. By examining how such a war might unfold, we see the urgent need for peace. Miscalculation and misunderstanding often pave the road to war. Avoiding catastrophe requires clear analysis, open communication, and a shared commitment to peace. The challenge before us is immense, but the consequences of failure are even greater. On this day, June 24, 2025, the world stands at a crossroads. If war broke out, China wouldn't seek a direct clash with US forces. Instead, it would use asymmetric tactics, unconventional methods to exploit American weaknesses. The strategy anti-access/area denial, or a 2/AD. Think of it as a massive keep-out zone in the Western Pacific. China would use missiles, submarines, and aircraft to make US carriers and bases too vulnerable to risk. The goal, make it too costly for the US to operate near China's coast, neutralizing America's biggest advantages. But the fight wouldn't just be physical. China would strike in cyberspace, targeting US military networks, power grids, and financial systems. Imagine blackouts, financial chaos, and military confusion, all before a shot is fired. Disinformation campaigns would flood social media, sowing confusion and undermining American resolve. Economic warfare would follow. China could restrict exports of critical materials, disrupt global trade, and use its leverage as a major US debt holder. The aim, make the war so costly that American public support collapses. This is warfare that attacks prosperity and morale, not just armies. China's approach is to win by making the fight too painful for its adversary. The US would be forced to rethink every move, knowing that the battlefield extends far beyond the Pacific. In this new era, war is fought with information, economics, and technology as much as with missiles and ships. The challenge for the US is to adapt quickly, or risk being outmaneuvered. The stakes are not just military but economic and psychological. In a US-China war, the front lines could be anywhere. The outcome would depend on who adapts fastest to this new kind of conflict. The world would watch, hoping cooler heads prevail. China's a 2/AD strategy centers on its formidable missile arsenal. The DF-21D carrier killer and the hypersonic DF-17 are designed to threaten US carriers and bases from afar. These missiles travel at incredible speeds, making them nearly impossible to intercept. For decades, US carriers symbolized American power. Now they face unprecedented risk. US planners can no longer assume safe access to the Pacific. China's rocket force controls thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles, capable of overwhelming US bases in Japan and Guam. The goal, saturate defenses, disable runways, destroy aircraft, and disrupt command centers, crippling US air operations from the outset. This missile-centric approach lets China threaten high-value US assets from its own territory. It's a cost-effective way to challenge a superpower without matching its navy ship for ship. By investing in these technologies, China has shifted the military balance in the Indo-Pacific. The US must now spend billions on new defenses and rethink its entire strategy. China's missile force is a powerful deterrent and a game-changer in any future conflict. The era of uncontested US naval dominance in the Pacific is over. The next war, if it comes, will be fought at long range, with speed and precision. The question, can the US adapt before it's too late? The answer may decide the fate of the region. Beyond missiles, China's Navy, the Plan, has become the world's largest by ship count. Modern destroyers, frigates, and corvettes armed with advanced missiles now challenge US supremacy in the Western Pacific. China's submarine fleet, both nuclear and diesel-electric, is designed for stealth and lethality. Their mission, hunt US carriers, lay mines, and disrupt shipping. This underwater threat forces the US to devote massive resources to anti-submarine warfare. China is also rapidly expanding its amphibious assault capabilities, preparing for possible operations against Taiwan. New landing ships and amphibious transports can carry thousands of troops and vehicles. China's own aircraft carriers, though fewer and less advanced than America's, signal its ambition to project power far from home. These carriers extend China's reach and provide air cover for its fleets. The plan's growth puts pressure on Taiwan and forces the US and allies to constantly adapt. China is no longer content to defend its coast, it aims to dominate the Pacific. The maritime balance is shifting, and the world is watching. Control of the skies is vital, and China's Air Force, the PLAAF, has modernized rapidly. The stealthy J-20 fighter rivals America's best, slipping past defenses to strike key targets. Long-range bombers like the H-6K threaten US bases and fleets from afar. Airborne early warning planes and drones give China a real-time view of the battlefield. But do Chinese drones pose a significant threat in a potential war with the USA? China has rapidly expanded its drone fleet, fielding swarms of small expendable drones as well as larger armed models capable of precision strikes. These drones can overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers, disrupt enemy operations, and provide vital surveillance deep behind enemy lines. Advanced models like the Winglong and CH-5 can carry guided munitions and loiter for hours, making them formidable tools for both attack and reconnaissance. Compared to US drones like the MQ-9 Reaper, Chinese drones are catching up in range, payload, and autonomy, though the US still leads in combat experience and network integration. In a conflict, China's ability to deploy massive numbers of drones could challenge US air defenses and complicate American operations. In space, China's satellite network tracks US movements and guides its forces. The Beidou navigation system ensures China's military isn't reliant on US GPS. Critically, China has tested anti-satellite weapons, missiles and lasers that could blind US forces. A war in space would cripple communications, navigation, and intelligence. The battle for the skies now extends into orbit. In a US-China war, dominance above the clouds could decide the outcome below. The race for air and space superiority is on. GAP-1S. While missiles and fighter jets capture headlines, another war rages in the shadows, one fought with code, not bullets. China's cyber capabilities have become a cornerstone of its military strategy, targeting the United States on a battlefield with no borders, cyberspace. First, cyber espionage. Chinese state-backed hackers have already breached American government networks, defense contractors, and critical industries, siphoning off secrets to erode the US technological edge. In a conflict, these efforts would intensify, stealing battle plans, disrupting communications, and even compromising weapon systems before a shot is fired. Next, infrastructure attacks. China could target power grids, water supplies, and transportation networks, aiming to paralyze civilian life and sow chaos. Hospitals could be hit with ransomware, financial systems frozen, and emergency services overwhelmed. The goal: undermine American morale and distract military planners. Disinformation campaigns would flood social media with fake news, deepfakes, and conspiracy theories, eroding public trust and dividing the nation. By manipulating narratives, China could slow decision-making and stir unrest, weakening America from within. Economic disruption is another potent weapon. Coordinated cyber strikes on banks, stock exchanges, and supply chains could trigger market crashes and shortages, amplifying the shockwaves of physical conflict. These cyber tactics are not isolated, they're woven into China's broader strategy. By softening US defenses, sowing confusion, and draining resources, cyber warfare sets the stage for success in the air, at sea, and on land. In the next war, the most decisive battles may be fought on servers and screens, long before the world hears the first alarm. If war broke out, China's first priority would be to destroy key US military assets in the region, especially those threatening its operations around Taiwan. The strategic objective here is to quickly establish local superiority and prevent the US from reinforcing Taiwan or launching counterattacks. US bases in Japan, Guam, and the Western Pacific would likely be among the first targets, as neutralizing them would cripple America's ability to project power and reinforce Taiwan. By striking these bases, China aims to limit US air and naval operations, buying time to achieve its own objectives on the ground and at sea. China would also aim to destroy or disable US communication infrastructure, radar sites, command centers, and cyber networks, to blind and disrupt American forces. Cyber warfare would play a critical role, with both sides likely launching attacks to disrupt logistics, command, and even civilian infrastructure. Attacks on US satellites would be a top priority, as knocking out GPS, surveillance, and communication satellites would paralyze US military coordination. The loss of space-based assets would also impact civilian navigation, communications, and global financial systems, raising the stakes far beyond the battlefield. US naval assets, especially aircraft carriers and destroyers, would be targeted with missiles and submarines to deny the US control of the seas near Taiwan. Control of these waters is crucial for both sides, as it determines the ability to move troops, supplies, and enforce blockades or amphibious landings. By striking these targets first, China would hope to delay or prevent US intervention, gaining a decisive advantage in the opening hours of conflict. At the same time, both nations would be acutely aware of the global economic and political consequences, with allies and adversaries watching closely. The initial blows would set the tone for the entire war and determine who controls the future of the region. For China, the goal is to force a quick resolution before the US can fully mobilize, while the US seeks to hold the line and rally international support. The outcome would not only shape the fate of Taiwan, but also the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific for decades to come. A US-China war would trigger instant global economic chaos. Trade routes through the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, arteries of global commerce, would shut down. Shelves would empty, factories would halt, and markets would crash. Financial ties would unravel, with both sides imposing sanctions and freezing assets. The shock would ripple worldwide, causing recession, shortages, and social unrest. Every nation would be forced to pick sides, splitting the world into rival blocs. International institutions would be paralyzed, alliances tested, and some would break. The rules-based order since World War II would be shattered. Political instability would spread, with fragile states at risk of collapse. The world would become poorer, more divided, and far more dangerous. The economic devastation would last for generations. The political fallout would reshape the global landscape. The greatest fear is escalation, a limited conflict spiraling into nuclear war. Attacks on US bases or Chinese ships could widen the war, drawing in allies and raising the stakes. Both nations are nuclear-armed. Under extreme pressure, either could reconsider their nuclear policies. Cyber attacks or strikes on satellites could be misread as preludes to all-out war. In the chaos, a single miscalculation could trigger catastrophe. Once the escalation ladder is climbed, it's nearly impossible to step back. Preventing that first step is the world's most urgent challenge. When tensions reach their peak, many wonder, could China actually send troops to land in the United States or even launch a direct assault on American soil? Let's break down the reality behind this scenario. First, consider the sheer distance. Over 6,000 miles of open ocean separate China and the continental US. Unlike regional operations, an amphibious or airborne assault across the Pacific would require an unprecedented scale of logistics, planning, and secrecy. The Chinese military would need to move hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, aircraft, and all the supplies necessary to sustain an invasion force. Even the world's most advanced militaries have never attempted such a feat. Next, the US mainland is protected by some of the most formidable defenses on the planet. American early warning systems, air power, naval fleets, and missile defenses create multiple layers of deterrence. Any large-scale movement across the Pacific would be detected long before reaching American shores, giving the US time to mobilize overwhelming force. Historically, no nation has ever successfully launched an intercontinental invasion across oceans of this size. Even during World War II, the largest amphibious assaults, like D-Day, took place over just a few dozen miles of water, not thousands. The logistical and strategic challenges of crossing the Pacific are magnitudes greater. Military experts widely agree. A Chinese invasion of the US mainland is not a realistic scenario. The obstacles are simply too great, both in terms of logistics and military risk. Any conflict between the US and China would almost certainly be fought far from American soil, focused on the Western Pacific and surrounding regions. The specter of a direct invasion remains more the stuff of fiction than military reality. After all the analysis, one truth is clear: a US-China war would be catastrophic for both nations and the world. There would be no real winners, only devastation, economic ruin, and lasting scars. Both governments know the stakes and have reasons to avoid direct conflict. The challenge is managing rivalry without letting it erupt into war. This requires wisdom, restraint, and constant communication, especially between militaries. Building trust and finding areas for cooperation are essential. The future depends on leaders and citizens choosing dialogue over confrontation. Understanding the risks isn't fear-mongering, it's motivation for peace. The task of our time: keep the unthinkable a question, never a reality. In the event of a US-China conflict, the world would be forced to make difficult choices. Historical alliances and current geopolitical realities would shape who supports whom, though not always in predictable ways. On the side of the United States, NATO allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany and France would likely offer diplomatic and possibly military support, honoring long-standing defense commitments. Japan, South Korea and Australia, key partners in the Indo-Pacific, would face immense pressure to join the US, given their security treaties and concerns over regional stability. India, wary of China's growing influence, might also tilt toward Washington, especially if its own interests are threatened. China, meanwhile, would look to its closest partners. Russia, with its strategic partnership and shared interests in counterbalancing American power, could offer support, though likely in indirect ways. North Korea might see opportunity in chaos, aligning with Beijing. Pakistan, a longtime Chinese ally, could also lend diplomatic or logistical backing. Other nations and blocs would weigh their options carefully. The European Union, Southeast Asian countries, and much of Africa and Latin America might resist taking sides, prioritizing economic interests and regional stability. Some nations would see involvement as too risky, preferring neutrality or mediation. Motivations would vary. Security guarantees, economic ties, and long-standing rivalries would all play a role. Yet, in a world more interconnected than ever, even those who remain officially neutral would feel the far-reaching consequences of such a conflict.